Hey class, it's me. So here we are at Module 4, and Module 4 is a little different because some of you are going to be comparing and looking at different issues. But the idea is to really, before we go in depth about the framework and the different types of moral theories out there, to just spend a little bit of time identifying and explaining our views on some contemporary moral problems. So while I'm going to talk about a couple of the articles, you may or may not end up reading all of the articles. You definitely won't read all the articles for this module, but you are going to create an argument in your second essay in response to a philosophical writing on a particular contemporary moral problem. So you'll notice that the range of topics in part 3 of Exploring Ethics, your textbook, range from articles on for and against, in defense of abortion in some cases, not all, against abortion, euthanasia, world hunger, terrorism, torture, capital punishment, pornography, animal rights, the environment, and affirmative action. Now, while these topics may not in fact be, I'm not suggesting that they are the only moral problems on the planet, they are a good sample of many of the ethical ideas that we have out there. So just think of it this way. There have been people making arguments about what is ethical behavior for nation states for years. So here I have a picture that I took this summer when I was in the UK of Hadrian's Wall. So the Roman legion built this wall somewhere around the end of the 2nd century to keep the brutish Pictish Scots from coming in because they couldn't manage them. So this was a wall that spans like 80 kilometers, and it's I could be wrong on the mileage, but it is spans the northern border of between England and Scotland, and it's still there. And now the wall, built to keep the other out, basically has sheep on both sides. But at one point, the argument was those people don't belong over here, or we can't control them, so we're going to build a wall to keep them out. So I did want to bring up Peter Singer, who's an Australian man. He's still alive. He's quite senior, but he is a utilitarian moral philosopher. You have an example of one of his essays in here, which has to do with poverty and world hunger. But some of the other videos that I've included in this module refer to Peter Singer frequently. So I thought it would be helpful to just talk a little bit about how he constructs moral arguments. So Peter Singer, in the article about I lost my spot, on famine, affluence, and morality. His basic assertion is that human beings have a moral obligation to care for people even if you can't see them. So just because we may not know about poverty because it's in some other country or some other part of this country, if we can do something to help, we should do something to help. So some of the arguments against this moral obligation to help people comes from people like Garrett Hardin, who say that, in a lifeboat, you can't necessarily take everyone, and that's okay, because you just have, you have to at least keep some people alive. But Peter Singer's overarching argument is that human beings really only have one boat, and if there's something that we can do to actually alleviate poverty, world famine, we should do that thing. Now, I'm not going to take a position in favor of Peter Singer or against Peter Singer, but he's such a prolific writer that it's kind of helpful to understand his point of view on a couple of different issues. He has a similar moral argument on our moral obligation to non-human animals. He has arguments about why it's more moral to be a vegetarian, more moral to really consider how we treat non-human animals, and that we should consider, if we wouldn't do something to a human, we shouldn't do it to a non-human animal. And he says the idea of preferring humans over other species, he calls it speciesism, and he sees that as a problem. Now, we're going to get into a little bit later about what utilitarian philosophy is, and this may make more sense to you when we get to that. But I want you to notice the key thing here is his conclusion is that people have a moral obligation to help those even if they can't see them. And then he has several different premises that support that. Now, one thing nice about the selection of articles that Stephen Kahn has in this book, he has another article which is actually a reply to Peter Singer. So you might be interested in these two articles. And on page 275, Travis Timmerman actually does a really good job of examining Peter Singer's moral arguments. So I thought it was important to show you how helpful it is sometimes to number things. So I want you to get in the habit of looking at all of these authors' arguments and numbering them. So, suffering and death from lack of food and shelter and medical care are bad. Okay, so that's premise number one. Premise number two is, if it is in your power to prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything nearly as important, it is wrong not to do so. Third premise, by donating to aid agencies, you can prevent suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care without sacrificing anything nearly as important. Therefore, if you do not donate to aid agencies, you are doing something wrong. So number 4 is the conclusion, and we see that because whatever follows therefore is sort of a concluding argument. So this is a really helpful piece here. So it helps you to identify exactly what the argument is being made, and also what perhaps Travis Timmerman, you can then go through and read Travis Timmerman's argument or response to Singer and why he may, why he might disagree with him about you should not be obligated to spend your entire life saving children. Okay, so the other argument in here, which you may not choose to read right away, but I want to talk to you about it because it's a very famous essay. Um, it's Judith Jarvis Thompson's defense of abortion argument. Now, so I want to talk about this a little bit because not because I want you to have to share Judith's view, but I do want you to notice how she is making an argument. So she starts off in this essay saying that she's not going to try and create a defense of abortion based on the fetus, the idea that the fetus is not a person. Because the argument kind of ends there. And the point is, it's actually kind of difficult for people to agree on when the fetus becomes a person. You know, is it at 3 weeks? When is it? So what she does is she starts out, and you're going to notice this in a lot of the videos of talking about the thought experiment. So a thought experiment really is just, can I create some sort of ridiculous situation to help explore the situation at hand? So she creates a thought experiment to explore the situation of pregnancy. She says, let's say you wake up one day and find yourself hooked to a famous violinist who has severe kidney problems, and he can only be saved by being hooked up to your kidneys for 9 months. Now you've been abducted, you don't have any control over this, and you have, but this very famous violinist would die without your intervention. So one thing Judith seems to be saying is, don't you have a right to preserve your own life, even if the violinist is really famous? So I want you to notice in the box on the right, I have actually identified some of the arguments that Judith makes herself, because she is trying to defend abortion, that some abortion is permissible, or abortion is not impermissible, but she doesn't argue that it's always permissible, which is her concluding argument. So, and notice that she actually numbers her arguments. So one of the things that you can do as you're going through and really analyzing the writing for whatever pair of text you decide to read is to get in the habit of noticing how the author is identifying their own arguments or the arguments of their opponents and diagramming them. And it's really helpful, one, to number the ideas, and then within those ideas, if you can identify the difference between the premises and the conclusions. So in her first point, she says that a woman can surely defend her life against the threat to it posed by the unborn child. So this is, one question that comes up with a defense of abortion, a moral defense of abortion, would be in the case of someone where the mother's life is actually medically threatened by the unborn child. And so she tries to get around saying, well, okay, they both have life. So, and some people say, well, then it's wrong to kill the unborn child. But she examines in her third point that the child's right to life is not more important than the mother's right to life. So it's interesting. So I've skipped over argument 2, 4, and 5 in favor of pointing out her argument 6, because she actually quotes the story of the Good Samaritan. And she says, perhaps the Good Samaritan is too high a bar, and we could talk about someone, the minimally decent Samaritan. But one thing she does end up saying in this section is that there's no law that states you should support another person for 9 months to your detriment. So would anyone do that? Just randomly take care of a person for 9 months if it caused harm to yourself? So you don't have to agree with Judith Jarvis. You might even find that there's flaws in her argument. But what I do want you to do is really look at the structure of the argument. So instead of just sort of being swayed by the emotion of these topics, to look at the structure of the argument. Now, I don't mean to be emotionally manipulative or anything, but this is something that I think everyone will face. What is your argument about prolonging life? Now, I should explain the picture. The picture is a picture of my father, and it was taken in December of 2014. My father passed away in June of 2015. And what you can't tell from this picture is that my father was blind at the end of his life, and he had Parkinson's. So he could not stand or move around without the aid of someone else, and his whole body was always in spasm. And at the end of his life, he was not able to actually swallow any food or liquids. And he died of natural causes. So I'm putting this out there to you, not to kind of like, I had a great dad, he lived a great life. But actually, some people, when they think about their life, they say, I've heard a lot of people say, if I can't take care of myself, I don't want to live anymore. And I always ask him, well, my father was completely dependent on people. He had 24-hour care. He was lucky that he could have that. But he never expressed wanting to end his life early. So I'll just put that out there. So it might be different if there was another person who was a Parkinson's patient who had the same kind of situation and wanted to end their own life. That, I think, would have a different view. But I want you to think about, what is your view for yourself? Because this is actually something that all of us face. So it's not theoretical. You face it with yourself. You probably will face it with elders or parents. Do you have a right to prolong the life of a loved one? Do you have the right to prolong the life of someone else on the planet that you don't know? It's hard to be consistent. So I had this view of my father that I wanted him to, I selfishly wanted him to live longer, but he was experiencing a lot of pain. But did that mean that his last few years of life, were not worth living? I don't know. I thought they were. He seemed to think they were. But on the other hand, you could have somebody else who was in a different situation. So I'm not sure that I am completely consistent, but I do know that this question about prolonging life is something all of us have to kind of come to terms with, what our view is. And one of the ideas of this class, when we're exploring ethical decision making, is to kind of diagram out why we think what we do, and to really evaluate how consistent it is. Okay, So for essay number 2, what I really want you to do is just take at least 2 articles. There's some sections that have 3 articles, but in those cases, just choose 2. So, and really diagram the arguments, okay? And then I want you to take a point of view. Please do not write a paper where you say, well, he has some points there and she has some points there. And in this situation, don't do that. Take a stand. It's an exercise. Realize that you don't even have to actually believe what you're arguing. I want you to try and take a stand. But certainly it's probably easier if you have some sense of agreement with the author. So in the pair of articles about terrorism, Michael Walzer takes a pretty straightforward view on terrorism, saying it's not permissible. Lionel McPherson on terrorism says, well, it may be justifiable. So look and see, are there any ways that these 2 authors overlap? And as you read there, now you may not decide to read these 2, but who do you agree with more and why? Is it really because of just some sort of random feeling, or is there some kind of logic and reason behind you feeling what you feel, or agreeing, asserting what you believe? So I thought it might be useful to everyone to just add a little bit more advice about writing philosophy papers. So I actually took this from a book entitled Writing Philosophy Papers by Zachary Seech. And there's some interesting things in here, but he gives this as an example of an opening paragraph to a thesis defense paper. So this is something you might see in this paper. You might actually be saying something this straightforward. So here's the example of a good opening paragraph to a thesis defense paper, which is essentially what you're writing in these ethics papers. Animal experimentation is necessary in the search for cures for human diseases. 4 basic points to be argued for in this paper lead to this conclusion. First, humans generally have a greater obligation to preserve human life than to preserve animal life. Second, some cures cannot be discovered in any other way. Third, despite popular misconceptions, very few of these experimental projects do in fact cause serious harm to the animals. Fourth, some of the experiments give us information about the animal species that ultimately is used to protect individuals of that species or the species itself. Okay, so maybe you don't agree with this point of view, but it is a point of view. That's what I want you to do. And then the body of the paper, you'll see the first statement here is the conclusion of the argument. And then he has, or she has, 4 specific reasons to support this conclusion. Now, I would say that a strong paper should have a conclusion, and also a strong paper will examine the arguments against these premises. So here's an argument I have. It may not make any sense to you, but I think that Philosophy 135 students, meaning you, should consider studying abstract art. And I have this picture by an Australian artist, John Olson. The title of the work is called You Butte Country. So here's my broken down argument. Abstract art is a field in the discipline of visual arts. Visual arts communicates ideas non-verbally, without use of language. Nonverbal disciplines open people to nonlinear or creative modes of communication and expands their understanding of the world. College students, who are people, that's like implied here, from any major can benefit from exploring nonverbal disciplines. Therefore, philosophy students should explore abstract art when examining arguments. Now, I'm not saying that it's the best argument on the planet, but what I want you to see is that each one of the statements ties into the next statement. So when you're creating an argument, that's what you want to do. You want to show all of your support and reasoning behind what connects with what. So I look forward to reading your papers. Let me know if you have any questions.